Welcome to this presentation on Italian armour and tank doctrine during World War II, with a focus on their designs and battlefield performance against the British in North Africa. Despite Italy's ambition to field modern tanks, a complex mix of industrial limitations, design challenges and evolving battlefield realities shaped their armoured forces and ultimately their effectiveness. There have been a lot of debates on the channel about the Italian tanks and how they compared to Allied tanks' performance, opinions and debates about when the tanks were obsolete and whether the Italian tanks were decent for their time, bad, or completely unfit for purpose. I want to go through with you, the viewers, a review of the tanks available and their timelines to both the Italians and British forces fighting in North Africa, as well as the tanks, a comparison of the armoured doctrine of the Italian and British armies. Italy's main tank designs during World War II evolved from light and medium tanks like the L640, M1139, M1340 and M1441 to more advanced types that didn't reach the deserts of North Africa, such as the Cellere Seriano experimental tank, the M1542 and the heavy P40. The M1139 medium tank, introduced early in the war, was influenced by British design, the Vickers 6-ton. It featured a 37mm gun in the hull and two turret-mounted machine guns, but suffered from inadequate firepower and armour by wartime standards. Weighing around 11 tons, it was closer to a light tank in capability. This tank was not fit for purpose in North Africa. The M1340 was the primary Italian tank in North Africa, a medium tank armed with a 47mm turret gun capable of penetrating most Allied armour early in the war. Only the Matilda, early on in the campaign, proved a difficulty because of the armour. The M13 had a 4-man crew and armour up to about 42mm thick. This was the peak of the Italian M series. The M1340 was a useful tank until around late 1941 or early 1942, when improved British models arrived in North Africa. The tank was an adequately serviceable medium tank in the infantry support role. The Italians needed a vehicle as a breakthrough too, and the M1340 had to fulfil this role. Not ideal for the tank, but early on in North Africa there were victories against less armoured Allied forces, but it became too difficult as the campaign progressed. After nearly 2 years of service, the tank proved insufficient against later British and American tanks. Incremental changes led to the slightly improved M1441 that shared the same design. The M1441's changes were not significant to make any difference to performance. These tanks first entered service around late 1941 and were obsolete within months of entering service. The L640 was a relatively small, lightweight tank. It had a crew of 2. Armour thickness ranged from 6mm to 40mm. The turret housed the main armament, which was a single Breda Modello 35 20mm autocannon, plus a coaxial Breda 38 8mm machine gun. The tank was mainly used for reconnaissance and severely limited for tank versus tank combat. There were other vehicles capable for reconnaissance in North Africa, such as the AB-41 and the Sparviberti AS-42. This is a tank that, in my opinion, should not have been built had Fiat Ansaldo been able to produce more M1340 tanks or had other designs, unless it was a tank to be used for policing back in mainland Italy. The L640 was quicker at a top speed, just over 42 km/h, but there are too many deficiencies with the tank. High command of the Regio Esercito were not enthusiastic about the L640. Recognising the obsolescence of earlier models, Italy developed the M1542 as an interim solution. It carried a longer barrelled 47mm gun, a more powerful 190 horsepower Fiat Spar petrol engine, and slightly increased armour. Yet this upgrade arrived too late and in limited numbers to alter the course of the war significantly. The upgrades were not enough, and the tank still shares similarities to the M1340's design. Still not enough armour for modern tank combat at the time. The tank was obsolete from the start, and came too late for the deserts of North Africa. Ansaldo engineers experimented with the Crusader Italiano, a much better design, one they should have had as a faster tank rather than, looking at it from hindsight, the L640, a tank designed for desert warfare and to combat the opposing cruiser tanks of the Allied forces. The tank had great speed but thin armour. The same longer barrelled 47mm gun used on the M1542 would be used for this tank. The Crusader Italiano would be a cavalry tank, but the Regio Esercito were discouraged due to the ease of destruction of British Crusader tanks, and the tank was also developed too late for North Africa. In North Africa, the tank's speed would have been very useful. By the time the prototype is built, more firepower and armour is needed on the tank for later theatres. It would be obsolete. The tank never went into mass production. The Carro Armato P40 represented Italy's attempt at a modern heavy tank. Equipped with a 75mm long-barrelled gun and armour up to 50mm on the front, it was more comparable to contemporary Allied tanks. However, it suffered from a cramped two-man turret design that forced the commander to also serve as the gunner, slowing combat effectiveness. Production delays and mechanical issues further limited its impact, and again it came far too late for North Africa. Earlier Italian doctrine initially emphasised tanks for infantry support rather than armoured breakthroughs or tank versus tank combat. Tanks were built for European theatres in mountainous terrain. This approach was evident in early war models like the M1139 and M1340, designed primarily to assist infantry rather than to engage enemy armour decisively. A change to the armoured doctrine came in 1938 that required a breakthrough tank more heavily armoured than the medium tanks, but the Italian army would not get one for the North African campaign. The doctrine was influenced by the Germans' combined arms warfare. The Italians wanted a capable tank to punch through enemy armour, open gaps and disintegrate enemy forces to allow fast-moving units of infantry to exploit, all units supported by artillery. The fighting in North Africa exposed the severe shortcomings of the earlier infantry intrinsic doctrine and equipment. Italian tanks lacked sufficient firepower to pierce the armour of tanks like the Valentine and Matilda, and later American models with superior armour and armament. Italian armoured units suffered from mechanical unreliability in harsh desert conditions and limited logistical support, impacting operational readiness. The inadequate turret layout on many models forced commanders to take on the gunner role, reducing battlefield effectiveness. Italy's industrial limitations meant mass production of advanced tanks was not feasible, resulting in low numbers of heavy and upgraded tanks like the P40, a tank that came too late. The British tank forces in North Africa relied on a mix of armoured vehicles adapted to the desert war with distinct roles and evolution through the campaign. The cruiser tanks, Cruiser Mark 1, 2, 3 and 4, were designed for speed and manoeuvre warfare, complementing slower infantry tanks. Early models had relatively light armour, typically ranging from 6mm to 30mm thick, and armament centred around the 2-pounder 40mm gun. These tanks were moderately fast and used to exploit breakthroughs and outflank enemy positions. Their weak armour made them vulnerable, but they were an important mobile force in the early desert battles. The Cruiser Mark IV featured some improvements like the Christie suspension for better cross-country mobility, but still suffered from thin armour and fragile tracks. The Mark IV was, in my opinion, barring the Matilda II, the only British-built tank on par with the M1340 up until the fall of 1941, when the Crusader tanks appeared in the desert. The Matilda II was an infantry tank and heavily armoured for its time, with frontal armour up to 78mm thick, making it nearly impervious to Italian and early German anti-tank weapons early on in the campaign. Armed with a 2-pounder gun, it excelled in infantry support and defensive roles, but was slow, with low top speed and limited mobility in desert terrain. The Matilda was instrumental during the early British successes such as Operation Compass, wreaking havoc on Italian tanks like the M1340 and the outdated M1139 and L3 tankettes. The Italian tanks struggled to get through the armour of the Matilda during the early years of the North African campaign. However, it was not long before the 2-pounder, which lacked HE shells for the Matilda, was obsolete. The British realised that the Matilda would be too slow for modern desert warfare. The tank was replaced on the front line by the cheaper to produce and reliable Valentine. Many Matildas were lost during Operation Crusader and few were left in North Africa during the Second Battle of El Alamein. The Crusader tank was a British cruiser tank that saw extensive deployment in the North African campaign during World War II, starting with operations in 1941. Designed for speed and mobility, it had a powerful 340 horsepower V12 engine, allowing a top road speed of 42 km per hour, and was well suited to the open desert terrain. Its main armament was initially the QF 2-pounder gun, which proved inadequate against Axis armour as the campaign progressed. The later Crusader Mark III was upgraded with a 6-pounder 57mm gun, and first arrived at the Second Battle of El Alamein. The Mark III really boosted the performance and reputation of the Crusader. The Crusader's relatively light armour was a notable limitation, but its speed and manoeuvrability made it valuable for flanking actions and rapid advances in desert warfare, despite suffering significant losses due to concealed anti-tank guns and mechanical issues in the harsh desert environment. The Valentine, an unsung hero in my opinion for the British forces. The Valentine was introduced later to complement and eventually replace the Matilda, a smaller and cheaper tank. Though lighter, with armour up to 60mm and equipped initially with the 2-pounder, it was reliable and versatile. The Valentine was noted for its mechanical reliability and suitability for prolonged desert conditions, serving widely throughout the campaign and beyond. The Valentine also had an improved suspension, enabling it to maintain top speeds across desert terrain more effectively compared to the Matilda. The Matilda was removed from the front line for the Valentine to take its place around 1941. The introduction of later models with the 6-pounder late on in the campaign gave the tank more firepower, but it did give the crew problems. A redesign of the turret to accommodate the larger gun resulted in a confined fighting compartment with cramped conditions. Supplied by the United States through Lend-Lease, the M3 Stuart was a fast and lightly armoured light tank armed with a 37mm gun. It was mainly used for reconnaissance and infantry support. While agile and quicker than heavier British tanks, its light armour made it vulnerable to most Axis anti-tank weapons and wouldn't be too much of a problem for Italian armoured divisions. The M3 Grant, a variant of the American Lee, was significant in improving British armoured capabilities. It featured a 75mm main gun mounted in the hull and a 37mm turret gun. Though somewhat awkward due to its 2-gun design, it brought needed firepower and armour to face German panzers. It played a key role from late 1942 onwards, notably during battles like El Alamein. Despite armour and a decent gun, it was quite a tall tank with limited gun depression and could not make use of hull-down positions in the desert. It had limited gun traverse but a decent top speed at 42 km per hour. The tank performed well in North Africa, despite being phased out by the M4 Sherman. The M4 Sherman succeeded the Grant and became the primary battle tank of British armoured forces. With a 75mm turret gun, improved armour and better crew ergonomics, it offered a well-balanced combination of firepower, protection, mobility and reliability. Shermans could carry high explosive shells useful against infantry and fortifications, unlike earlier British 2-pounder armed tanks. The Sherman's introduction marked a major step forward in the Allies' tank forces in North Africa. This tank completely outclasses the Italian M tanks deployed in North Africa by the time it is deployed. This further highlights the struggles of Italy's tank development and production. One small group of Churchills operating within a unit named King Force were used at the Second Battle of El Alamein. This slow infantry tank, taking the role of the Matilda II, was a success for its short time in North Africa. The Churchill Mark III was also fitted with the 6-pounder gun, giving it enough firepower. The tank had incredible armour of 102mm at the front. Sources have stated that one of these Churchill tanks received 80 hits during the battle from Axis guns and still did not get knocked out. This tank was not just a problem for Italian and German tanks, but artillery too. Let's think about the British tank doctrine. The doctrine distinguished between infantry tanks like the Matilda and Valentine, designed to support foot soldiers with heavy armour but slower speeds, and cruiser tanks which prioritise speed for mobile warfare and flanking, akin to a cavalry tank. The Desert Campaign demanded high mobility, and British tanks were adapted through successive models to improve reliability and firepower. The arrival of American tanks, the M3 Grant and M4 Sherman, significantly enhanced British armoured capabilities, providing better armament and versatility. British tanks often coordinated closely with artillery and infantry units, using their armour to exploit enemy weaknesses exposed by infantry advances and artillery barrages. So the British also recognised the necessity for combined arms, although adapted a little differently to the Italians' doctrine. Let's go through a quick review. This is a table of comparison, and this really does highlight how the Italians were up against it in North Africa. So first, to compare firepower, the early M1139 was underpowered and useless. The M1340's 47mm was effective, and that was up until at the latest early 1942, when you start to see more Valentines arriving in the desert with their 60mm of armour. Matildas were still present, although dwindling in numbers, and the Crusaders that have decent speed. The British had the 2-pounder gun, which had just enough firepower early on in the campaign but became obsolete quickly. A big turning point for the British is the introduction of the 6-pounder, and later models are upgraded featuring the gun. Both the Crusader and Valentine would have the 6-pounder gun later in 1942. A crucial point in the campaign which makes the situation extremely difficult for the Italian armoured divisions. Regarding 75mm guns, the Italians didn't manage to get the Cadwamato P40 in time, so no tank had a 75mm. They had to rely on artillery and self-propelled guns for firepower to knock out heavily armoured tanks. The Allies first received the M3 tanks around May 1942, so this tank gives the Allies a big boost in firepower along with speed and armour of the Crusader and Valentine tanks respectively. At the Second Battle of El Alamein during the fall of 1942, the M4 Shermans arrive with 75mm guns. The Italians are severely lacking a battle tank that can stand against the Allies' armour at this point. Armour proved to be a problem right from the start for Italian forces. Many tanks feature just 30mm of armour at the front, slightly more front turret armour of 42mm. But this is not a problem for the 2-pounder gun to get through, whereas the Italians would struggle against tanks like the Matilda and Valentine. The cruisers, including the Crusader, could be damaged and knocked out by the 47mm of the Italian Caddo M tanks. I should include an important note here on the construction of these vehicles in North Africa. We criticised the Italians for using bolted and riveted construction methods, but all of the British tanks were built with the same methods. Even the Churchill tank was mostly bolted and riveted. The only tank that featured welded construction was American, the M4 Shermans that arrived later in 1942. The M3 Grant was also riveted. Welding is a construction method that was commonly used in the later years of the war after the North African campaign. I have said that the Italian tanks were death traps in the desert, but so were most of the British-built tanks too. A significant weakness of Italian tanks, and a reason that British and Australian crews that used the M1340 felt they were not fit for purpose, was the two-man turret. Many British tanks at the time had a three-man turret. The commander of an Italian M tank would be overloaded and distracted by other duties taking on the gunner role. This prevents effective tactical observation and cohesive crew management. Mobility, you have to edge it to the British overall, but they did have slow tanks like the Matilda and Valentine. What I'm factoring in is reliability, the ability to keep on the move, maintain speeds and not break down. Only the Crusader had frequent engine reliability problems for the Allies. The Italian M tanks had constant problems with engine reliability despite improvements in air and sand filters to prevent engine deterioration. Of course, all tanks would have mechanical breakdowns and wear and tear due to the harsh conditions of the desert, but the Crusader seemed to be the only problematic tank during the Allied campaign in North Africa. The cruisers were generally faster than the Italian Caro M tanks. Only the L640 had comparable speed to the Crusader, but really lacked firepower with the 20mm autocannon and had a lack of armour. This tank was not suitable for frontline combat at that time. The M4 Sherman was also faster than the M tanks, along with the better firepower and armour. And finally, production. Due to the industrial limitations and the Fiat Ansaldo duopoly, Italy just couldn't keep pace with Allied tank development and production. Italy couldn't produce tanks in the thousands, and they couldn't create new designs quickly enough. It becomes evident during 1942. It gets tougher and tougher for the Italian tank crews by the month from early 1942 onwards during the campaign. To conclude, Italy's armoured forces in World War II were hampered by outdated designs, industrial limits and an earlier doctrinal focus on infantry support rather than armoured engagement. The changed doctrine, formalised around 1938, came too late and tank designs were not aligned to it. While later tanks like the P40 showed promise on paper, only a handful ever saw service, and too late for North Africa. Against better armed and armoured Allied tanks that appeared in the desert in 1942, Italian armour was often outmatched both tactically and technically. The Italians relied heavily on artillery and the effective self-propelled gun, the Semavente da 7518, late on in the campaign. But by no means did things go smoothly for the British either. When you analyse the campaign for both Axis and Allies, lots of counter-attacking and victories for both. Fine margins between victory and defeat. Both armies received a lot of casualties. For the Italian armoured units, they struggled despite brave efforts as the campaign progressed. Their tank doctrine remained less effective during the critical campaigns of the war.